Last week, I was sitting in a glitzy rooftop lounge in Mumbai, surrounded by young entrepreneurs who were practically buzzing with energy. One guy, leaning over his MacBook, he points at a headline glowing on his screen. India hits $4.18 trillion, world's fourth largest economy. He looks at me with this triumphant, almost defiant grin, saying, "Finally, the numbers don't lie. We've arrived." And for the next 10 minutes, he was just lost in this giddy monologue about fintech valuations and the inevitable rise of the Sensex. He was absolutely convinced those digits were the ultimate certificate of superpower status. But then something small happened. The air conditioning hummed, sputtered, and just died. A routine load-shedding flicker followed, dimming the ambient purple lights. So I asked him, where does the power for this district actually come from, or how the hardware for his newest venture was moving through the ports? His expression shifted instantly. It went from this visionary zeal to a sort of frustrated practice dismissal. The infrastructure, he sighed, waving a hand like I'd asked about some tedious household chore. The ports are a nightmare. The grid is, well, it's a work in progress, but look at the growth rate. And then he went right back to refreshing his stock app, seemingly oblivious to the chasm between his $4 trillion digital dream and the flickering bulb right above his head. That moment of cognitive dissonance is where the real story begins. We live in an era that worships financial heat, where $1 billion in legal fees or app transactions is treated the same as $1 billion in physical steel. But history is a cold physicist. It doesn't care about accounting tricks or nominal GDP milestones. It only remembers the civilizations that can actually master their physical metabolism, the ones that can pour the most concrete, generate the most stable gigawatts, and move cargo with surgical precision. As the West retreats into a vetocracy of endless debate and crumbling bridges, the world is undergoing this brutal, hardcore quality inspection. So is this $4.18 trillion a powerhouse of muscle and bone, or is it a metabolic bubble of services and office paperwork? Beneath the celebratory headlines lies a much more grounded physical question. In a world of hardening borders and shifting alliances, does a country's power come from the numbers on a spreadsheet or the physical momentum of its machines?
That experience, that little moment in the lounge, it just perfectly captures the core tension we need to resolve in this deep dive.
It really does.
When we look at that $4.18 trillion figure, the fundamental question for you, the informed observer, is whether this growth reflects genuine state capacity.
And what do we mean by state capacity exactly?
By that, we mean the ability of the government and the economy to effectively implement its plans to turn those abstract financial numbers into physical, repeatable reality.
Okay.
Or is it just predominantly service sector inflation that, masks these huge underlying structural weaknesses?
So that's our mission.
Our mission today is to conduct a thorough analysis of India's strategic pivot and its internal capacity against the hard, tangible benchmarks set by high-performing industrial states. We need to determine if the physical foundation can truly support the projected digital skyscraper, or if it's just, a high-rise built on sand.
I think that's a perfect starting point. The idea that national power is ultimately physical, not purely financial, it fundamentally changes how you view any modern economy. Let's unpack this with a focus on, let's call it the physics of GDP, a hardcore quality inspection. The disconnect is profound. And to illustrate it, I want you to consider a young man in an industrial suburb of Uttar Pradesh. He poured his life savings into a modern, high-precision welding machine, completely bought into the Make in India dream. He hears the news about the trillion-dollar milestones and the booming stock market, but in his workshop, his immediate reality is dictated by the energy metabolism of his neighborhood.
The physical reality.
The physical reality. Every afternoon, just as he needs to fuse high-grade steel for an order, the lights flicker and die. It's routine load shedding, sometimes for hours. He just sits there, staring at unfinished rebar and high-tech machinery that's standing silent. While the service sector in Bangalore or Mumbai is buzzing, generating billions in digital code, his physical world is paused. He isn't just waiting for electricity, he's waiting for the industrial bone structure of his country to catch up to its paper wealth. That story just highlights this crucial chasm between the aspiration and the reality.
And it's so much more than just an anecdote. It reflects the structural imbalance that becomes immediately apparent when we conduct a, as you put it, hardcore quality inspection of the GDP figures.
So where do we start?
We have to recognize the inherent weakness of nominal GDP first. It's an abstract concept that, by definition, masks vast differences in the, let's say, strategic value of national capacity. Nominal GDP equally records $1 billion generated from a massive physical steel production facility, which employs thousands, and provides material for bridges as it does $1 billion from complex derivative transaction fees or legal services.
Right. To the accountant, it's all the same.
To the national accountant, the numbers are interchangeable, yes. But to the state trying to build infrastructure, defend its borders, or project physical power, the capacity from the steel and the factory floor is just exponentially greater than what's provided by the paper economy.
So when we analyze India's current economic structure through that lens, we see a massive skew. We know that over 50% of the GDP is heavily reliant on the services sector, IT, hospitality, finance, all of it. Meanwhile, manufacturing's contribution, it's been stagnant for decades, hovering stubbornly around 15% of GDP.
And that structural configuration is the primary red flag when you benchmark it against successful industrialization. If you look at the historical trajectories of the successful East Asian economies, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, they all followed a predictable capacity-building path.
Right, a very different path.
Completely. They typically peaked with manufacturing contributions exceeding 30%, often closer to 35 or even higher, before they naturally shifted their focus toward high-value services. That 30% threshold was the point where the national economy achieved the critical mass of exports, physical infrastructure, and skilled labor needed to sustain long-term prosperity. India, well, it never achieved that robust physical base.
If the services sector is so dominant, doesn't that inherently lead to lower geopolitical leverage? I mean, you can't export a domestic legal fee, and you can't build a port with a consulting report.
Precisely. A significant portion of India's celebrated $4.18 trillion output is often, paperwork and litigation, consulting services, call center operations. And while these jobs are valuable, they lack the same kind of physical spillover effects as heavy industry. Manufacturing provides stable, high-value jobs for a massive, less educated labor pool. It drives innovation in logistics, energy, material science, and it's fundamentally tradable. A service-heavy economy built on consumption tends to be less resilient to global shocks and generates far less physical hard power. It's a consumption economy first, not a production economy.
To truly gauge the strength of this national muscle, we need to look beyond the nominal figures and use what we call the cold physics metrics. We need a hardcore quality inspection of the country's physical metabolic rate. So let's dive into those physical indicators, starting with energy metabolism, specifically per capita electricity.
This is the most foundational measure. It's the civilization's basic metabolic rate. Everything from the data centers in Mumbai to that welding machine in Uttar Pradesh requires constant, reliable power. And India's per capita annual electricity generation is, frankly, alarmingly low. It's approximately 1,200 kilowatt hours. To give that number meaning, you have to compare it to industrial peers.
That 1,200 kilowatt-hour figure is staggering when you put it in context.
It is. It's only 1/3 of China's per capita electricity capacity and about 1/4 of Germany's. Think about what that implies. China's industrialization was fueled by a massive, continuous supply of cheap, reliable energy. Germany, a modern, high-tech industrial power, maintains extremely high capacity to run its complex machinery and integrated smart grids. And industrial power simply cannot sustain its digital ambitions, its manufacturing aspirations, and its population's rising quality of life needs with this low level of energy capacity. The factory lights are flickering because the entire system is running at a dangerously low base metabolic rate that can't handle surges in industrial demand.
Okay, so if energy is the metabolism, then the steel skeleton per capita steel consumption, that's the measure of physical growth. Steel consumption is the clearest metric of a civilization's physical expansion. It tells us exactly how much they are building in the physical realm. Rail lines, industrial equipment, bridges, housing for an urbanizing population.
Exactly. And we see India's per capita steel consumption sitting at less than 80 kilograms. That is an extremely foundational level. It's indicative of an economy still in the very early stages of heavy construction and infrastructure build-out.
And when you contrast that with historical industrial peaks, the difference is night and day.
It is a profound gulf. Contrast India's 80 kilograms with China. During its height of rapid industrial expansion, the period when it laid down its national rail network and built its massive port facilities, China's per capita steel consumption exceeded 600 kilograms.
This immense difference, a factor of over 7, it shows you the comparative intensity of physical transformation and capital expenditure. If a nation is not consuming massive amounts of steel per person, it is simply not constructing the heavy, complex machinery, the rail infrastructure, or the high-rise urban and industrial complexes that define modern industrial power at scale. Steel consumption is a measure of physical gravity and ambition.
It is.
And finally, the logistics bloodline. Even if our guy manages to produce his welded steel, how efficiently can the economy move that product? This measures how quickly and cheaply goods can be moved, which is the lifeblood of any successful manufacturing base.
Well, if the national body has a low metabolism and a fragile skeleton, inefficient logistics act like blood clots. We see that India's major ports lag significantly behind global benchmarks like Shanghai's Yangshan port, which is highly automated and digitally integrated. Indian ports suffer from several key issues: persistent customs bureaucracy, depth restrictions that prevent the largest container ships from docking, and insufficient rail connectivity to the hinterland.
And those inefficiencies, they translate directly into economic costs, right?
Absolutely. Cargo delays, prolonged transit times, excessive handling fees. It all means India's logistics costs as a percentage of GDP are significantly higher than those of its successful manufacturing rivals. This inefficiency actively erodes the price competitiveness of any manufactured goods India tries to export. It puts immediate and constant pressure on that struggling 15% manufacturing sector. If you can't move it fast and cheap, you can't make it competitively.
So if the structure is service-heavy and the fundamental physical inputs, energy, steel, logistics, are all running at a low base rate, what developmental trend are we actually observing here?
We call this phenomenon premature deindustrialization, and it's a critical developmental anomaly that undermines long-term stability. It occurs when a country shifts its economic focus away from manufacturing before it has fully extracted the productivity gains that manufacturing provides. This shift usually happens because services growth is, well, initially easier and requires less heavy lifting in terms of infrastructure and political consensus. Historically, this shift happens at much higher income levels.
Can you elaborate on that historical comparison? That seems key to understanding the depth of this anomaly.
Let's use South Korea as the benchmark. South Korea began to naturally deindustrialize, meaning its services sector began overtaking manufacturing in importance around 1989. At that time, its per capita income was robust, almost $8,000, measured in 2010 constant US dollars. They had achieved a massive industrial base before they began the transition.
That's a foundation that can absorb the transition.
Precisely. Now look at India. India began shifting away from manufacturing, seeing its percentage contribution stabilize or decline around 2002. But its GDP per capita then was less than $900. That means India started deindustrializing at about 1/10 the income level of South Korea. This is not the conventional successful path. This trend results in large, seemingly prosperous economies that are structurally vulnerable because they lack the robust, job-creating industrial base necessary to sustain a massive population and project enduring power. The service jobs might create wealth for the elite, but the lack of manufacturing fails to create a deep, stable middle class.
It's the difference between a high stock market valuation based on speculative finance and actual tangible assets, a vast network of factories, efficient ports, and a stable power grid in the ground.
That comparison is crucial. $10 billion generated from complex financial services has far less national capacity value than $1 billion in steel output. The former is often a game of reallocating existing wealth or providing non-tradable domestic services, while the latter is a positive-sum engine of creating new physical matter, generating skilled labor, and expanding human living space. History judges nations not by their accounting software, but by their physical creation.
This profound structural challenge, this need for physical mastery, it leads us naturally to Section 2, the developmental state countermodel. If the goal is rapid, foundational physical expansion, and the current path leads to premature deindustrialization, we have to look at the historical playbook of states that successfully mastered this exact challenge.
We absolutely must analyze the countermodel because the historical evidence shows that structural transformation of this scale is rarely achieved by simply waiting for free markets to spontaneously generate heavy industry.
Let's start by defining the concept itself, often coined by political scientist Chalmers Johnson, the developmental state.
Johnson defined it as a state focused explicitly and unapologetically on economic development. It's ready and willing to take any necessary policy measures to achieve that singular objective of rapid industrialization. It's characterized by strong state intervention, extensive regulation designed to steer the market, and centralized strategic planning. It stands in contrast to three other state models. It's not a regulatory state like the U.S., which enforces standards but generally can't pursue proactive industrial policy. It's certainly not a predatory state, which just extracts resources for the elite. And it's much stronger than a weak state, which is simply incapable of action. The developmental state dictates the terms of engagement.
And the textbooks point directly to the famous examples in East Asia. We're talking about Japan, led by the infamous Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITI, which essentially directed private investment and set export targets. And South Korea, which used the Ministry of Trade and Industry, MPI, and the Economic Planning Board, EPB. These were state apparatuses that didn't just stand back and enforce rules, they were the central strategic command.
They were firmly and visibly in the driver's seat. And the key mechanisms they used define the trajectory of the late industrializers. First, industrial policy. This is the conscious strategy of promoting the growth of new, strategically important industries, say, shifting from textiles to shipbuilding, and aggressively managing the painful shifts from old, declining sectors to new, high-growth ones. This required proactive interventionism that a typical regulatory state finds politically impossible. They didn't just pick winners, they often created winners by dictating mergers, providing cheap capital, and demanding specific performance targets.
That requires not just strategic foresight, but the organizational power to tell massive companies what they can and cannot produce.
Absolutely. Which leads to the second major tool, capital mobilization. These governments knew they couldn't wait for the slow accumulation of domestic savings or unpredictable foreign investment. They actively intervened in the financial sector, often through state-controlled banks, mobilizing the majority of domestic capital pension funds, savings accounts, and steering it into the specific, strategically promising sectors that would generate the maximum national spillover effects. They were, in effect, highly centralized strategic venture capitalists operating at the national scale. And this is underpinned by a truly fascinating theory known as getting the price wrong, which was observed by economic historian Alice Amsden when she was studying South Korea's rise. I love that name because it's such a radical rejection of pure free market doctrine. It is a profound institutional insight. Developmental states intentionally intervened in the market, not to let prices reach some theoretical equilibrium, but to use policy tools to deliberately lower production costs for their chosen domestic industries. This was done through massive, sustained subsidies for energy, cheap, directed credit, controlled exchange rates that favored exporters, and manipulation of inflation and wage levels. The goal was simple and ruthless, to make their nascent firms hyper-competitive on the global stage, even if those prices deviated from the theoretical right market equilibrium.
But intentional market distortion like that sounds incredibly inefficient and prone to corruption. How did the developmental state manage the political and financial risk of those massive subsidies?
That is the critical distinction between a successful developmental state and a predatory one. The subsidies and market distortions were not handed out as gifts. They were strictly conditional. Firms that received state aid, the cheap credit or favorable exchange rates, were required to meet rigorous performance criteria, specifically in export volume and quality. If a firm failed to meet these targets, the aid was withdrawn. Sometimes the state even forced the firm to merge with a more successful competitor. The state used the power of the purse to enforce strict performance and maintain credibility.
And that strict control was only viable because of the final crucial component, embedded autonomy. That sounds like a contradiction. How do you be embedded, close to the private sector, and autonomous, insulated from their short-term demands at the same time?
It's the institutional brilliance of the model. The state rigidly guided and restricted the private sector through a highly educated and meritocratic bureaucratic elite, the technocrats. These officials were embedded because they were constantly consulting with industrial leaders to understand what the private sector needed to succeed. It was intelligence gathering. However, they maintained autonomy because they were insulated from short-term corporate lobbying or immediate political pressures. They were not elected officials worried about the next cycle. They were focused solely on a 20-year national plan. This insulation allowed them to prioritize the long-term national interest, resisting demands from powerful chaebols who sought quick profits and from populist politicians who sought immediate unsustainable wage hikes. It was an exercise in bureaucratic rigidity for the sake of strategic velocity.
That degree of centralized control and long-term planning is exactly what seems to be missing in the environment we see today in countries struggling with capacity building. But let's look at developmentalism in practice to see the tangible, physical output this doctrine achieved, starting with Tyler's auto industry.
Thailand provides an excellent case study of strategic coercion. They use strong import substitution policies, placing extremely high tariffs, sometimes as high as 80 to 150%, on finished goods like automobiles. This made it nearly impossible for foreign finished goods to compete with their nascent domestic factories. Critically, Thailand had the organizational strength, the hard state capacity, to enforce this against the demands of powerful multinational corporations and, significantly, their own rich citizens who wanted cheap, imported luxury cars immediately.
So they used market access as a lever to extract commitment.
Precisely. They told foreign auto industries, if you want to access our massive consumer base, you must set up joint ventures with a Thai company. They even implemented the crucial 51% rule, ensuring the Thai partner retained majority ownership. This was explicitly designed to guarantee that jobs, manufacturing technology transfer, and long-term profits stayed in Thailand. This firmness, coupled with the state's commitment to sustained infrastructure investment and maintaining an educated labor force, allowed them to maintain investor interest while extracting massive national benefits, laying the physical foundation for a major regional automotive hub.
And South Korea, of course, provides the most compelling success story in terms of raw numbers and output transformation from what was a post-war wasteland.
South Korea's strategy was masterfully sequenced. Immediately after the Korean War, it was one of the poorest countries on earth. They focused first on light industries, simple sectors like wigs, textiles, cotton spinning, leveraging cheap, abundant labor to penetrate the global export market. This created the initial foreign currency reserves. Once that foundation was established, the state financial resources were strategically mobilized and shifted toward heavy and chemical industries, or HCI, in the 1970s and 80s.
And this shift required immense capital investment, far beyond what the private sector could manage alone.
It did. It was a deliberate, heavy intervention that led directly to the rise of the enormous conglomerates known as chaebols. These firms were directed to focus on sectors like steel with Piasco, shipbuilding with Hyundai, and heavy machinery. The growth of Piasco, for instance, a state-guided steel company, was foundational. You cannot build a modern economy without massive, affordable steel. South Korea's state intervention guaranteed the steel supply, which then fueled the shipbuilding and construction boom.
And the physical results just speak for themselves. Their GDP per capita grew from a meager $876 in 1950 to over $22,000 by 2010. That is structural transformation achieved through sheer state will and directed physical expansion. It is the ultimate testament to mastering physical metabolism.
It is. They transitioned from post-war devastation to being one of the 4 Asian tigers, capable of competing globally because the state dictated the terms of engagement and directed capital where the maximum national spillover would occur, achieving that 30% manufacturing share needed for stability.
Moving on, we transition from the question of internal structure, the need for physical capacity, to external strategy. This is section 3. The geopolitical pivot from Atlanticism to Eurasia. The economic numbers might show a structural lag in manufacturing, but geopolitically, we are seeing massive physical projects being launched that suggest a very different and very long-term vision for self-reliance.
This is where India demonstrates a high degree of strategic pragmatism. It's recognizing that, regardless of internal economic structure, the old geopolitical certainties based on maritime global control are dissolving. They are making a physical investment in their own strategic autonomy.
I was reading an account about a logistics coordinator stationed near the future line of the International North-South Transport Corridor. He grew up thinking of the world as a series of ports and ships, the Atlantic model of trade flowing across oceans. But lately, his work has shifted entirely toward the dusty inland horizons of Eurasia. He tracks the slow but steady progress of pipelines and rail tracks that aim to bypass the old maritime bottlenecks. He describes a feeling of continental awakening, where the strategic autonomy of his country is no longer tied to the whims of distant naval powers, but to the literal pipes and tracks being laid across the earth. It is a profound transition from being a passive stopover on a sea route to becoming an active hub of a continental heartland.
That perspective illustrates a monumental shifting strategic foundation. For decades after its independence, India traditionally focused its trade and strategic alliances on sea-based networks. The formalization of the Connect Central Asia policy in 2012 signaled a firm and deliberate pivot toward continental integration. This move can be understood through the lens of early 20th century geographer Halford Mackinder's heartland theory. The idea that control of the vast Eurasian landmass shapes global power dynamics.
And the modern tools for controlling that heartland aren't just rail lines, but flows of energy and data.
Precisely. Control is exerted today through high-speed rail networks, fiber optic cables, ultra-high voltage power grids, and cross-border pipelines. These are concrete physical connections replacing the abstract reliance on alliance commitments. This pivot is happening now because the strategic risk of relying on distant maritime alliances, particularly those led by the U.S. and its allies, is compounded by what we are observing as the West's strategic contraction. As Western powers grapple with internal gridlock, political polarization, and crumbling domestic infrastructure, their global commitment inevitably wanes, forcing India to seek self-reliance through these concrete, physical Eurasian links.
So let's focus on the cornerstone of this new vision, INSTC and Chabahar. Tell us about the International North-South Transport Corridor.
The INSTC is a game-changing 7,200-kilometer multimodal network linking Mumbai in India to St. Petersburg in Russia, traversing Iran and the Caspian Sea. It was originally established by India, Iran, and Russia way back in 2000, underscoring its long-term strategic intent, but its implementation has only recently accelerated. From India's perspective, the INSTC offers two major strategic advantages. First, it reduces transit time by up to 40% and overall cost by 30% compared to the traditional sea route via the Suez Canal. And second, it's a direct strategic countermeasure to Chinese influence, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia.
And we are seeing its commercial viability finally ramping up. The Russian Ministry of Transport noted that the INSTC's volume grew by a significant 19% in 2024 alone, reaching about 26.9 million tons. That's tangible physical momentum replacing abstract potential.
But the truly critical link that unlocks the full potential of INSTC is Chabahar Port in Iran. Strategically, because Pakistan severs India from direct land access to inner Eurasia, Chabahar is pivotal. It provides direct access to Afghanistan and Central Asia. Recognizing this, India recently signed a critical 10-year, $45 million agreement to develop and operate the port. Its location on the Indian Ocean, bypassing the highly congested and potentially vulnerable Strait of Hormuz, offers a distinct geopolitical and logistical advantage over other Iranian ports.
And the operational data suggests this is moving past the conceptual phase. Between 2018 and 2024, the port handled over 450 vessels and more than 8.7 million tons of bulk cargo, primarily humanitarian and grain shipments to Afghanistan. The vessel and container traffic increased by over 34 to 43% in 2023-2024, showing that this physical link is gaining commercial traction.
Furthermore, the Chabahar Agreement has crucial geopolitical ripple effects, particularly strengthening the Armenia link. Iran has granted Armenia access to Chabahar Port, which facilitates trade with India, offering Armenia a viable southern connection. This strengthens trilateral cooperation, India, Iran, and Armenia, and enhances Armenia's transit position. This relationship acts as a crucial counterweight to the emerging Pakistan-Azerbaijan-Turkey axis in the South Caucasus region, which complicates regional stability.
This sounds incredibly ambitious, focusing on strategic physical connectivity, but when we look at trade dynamics, how does India stack up against its regional competitor, China, in the sheer volume of goods moving through these corridors?
The scale is still heavily skewed toward China. While India's strategic trade with Central Asia is growing, reaching approximately $2 billion in 2024, it is still dwarfed by China's staggering engagement, which stands at $66 billion with the region. This disparity highlights the persistent structural constraints that must be addressed, primarily severe connectivity bottlenecks, different rail gauges, inadequate road networks, and trade finance issues. Resolving those physical bottlenecks could unlock an immediate additional $2 billion in potential trade, but it requires massive directed capital investment.
I noticed that India's focus is practical and commodities-driven. Imports from Central Asia are dominated by mineral fuels, crude oil, and fertilizers, while exports are mostly pharmaceuticals, electrical machinery, and appliances. It's hard strategic trade, not just abstract financial flows.
And the push for physical connectivity extends far beyond Central Asia. It's a global vision for resource security. Consider the Chennai-Vladivostok Maritime Corridor, or CVMC. Launched in 2024, this 10,300-kilometer route links India's east coast to Russia's far east. It is a critical infrastructure project because it drastically cuts transit time by 40%, from 40 days down to only 24 days.
That reduction is huge for commodity movement.
Absolutely. This corridor is vital for enhancing India's energy security and conveying essential commodities like crude oil and coal, which have seen massive increases in volume due to recent geopolitical shifts. Crude oil shipments, for instance, are up 48% through this axis, and coal is up 87%. It demonstrates a clear physical long-term hedging strategy against instability in traditional energy supply lines.
And this seems to be underpinned by a proactive investment and future influence in the Russian Far East.
That's right. Back in 2019, India pledged a $1 billion line of credit for the development of Russia's Far East, making it India's first foreign region-specific program of this scale. This strategic move positions the region as a vital economic hub connecting Atlantic and Pacific networks, aligning perfectly with India's Act East policy and its ambitious goal of reaching $100 billion in trade with Russia by 2030. It's a proactive physical manifestation of strategic alignment.
But no major geopolitical pivot is without its challenges and rival corridors. What are the headwinds facing this new Eurasian physical strategy?
First and foremost is geopolitical friction. U.S. sanctions on Iran introduce constant uncertainty and compliance challenges for Indian entities operating Chabahar, despite the port's recognized humanitarian significance. Indian companies must navigate a highly complex regulatory environment, balancing compliance with the U.S. financial system against the strategic necessity of the port. Furthermore, the slow pace of the IRNSTC's completion since the original agreement in 2000 reflects India's resource limitations and procedural hurdles compared to China's massive Belt and Road Initiative funding machine.
Then there's the actual Eurasian corridor-rising rivalry we see playing out on the ground, specifically the rise of the Middle Corridor.
The competition is intensifying, driven by shifting global logistics demands. The Middle Corridor, or Trans-Caspian International Transport Route, is emerging as a major rival to INSTC. It is strongly backed by the EU's Global Gateway Initiative, which has pledged 300 billion euros, including a dedicated $10 billion investment specifically for Central Asia infrastructure. Traffic through this rival corridor is already growing rapidly, increasing by a staggering 86% in a single year, demonstrating its velocity advantage.
And the major strategic complexity here is China's involvement, even in corridors that theoretically compete with their own BRI.
That's the critical point. China formally joined the Middle Corridor through the China Railway Container Transport Corporation in 2024. This move gives Beijing dual access routes across Eurasia and, crucially, strengthens the rival corridor, potentially weakening the INSTC by drawing away crucial freight traffic and limiting its ultimate commercial viability. Furthermore, internal friction among INSTC members is a constant threat. The Zangezur corridor, favored by Azerbaijan and Turkey, represents competing interests.
Explain that friction point. What is the Zangezur corridor and why does it matter to INSTC?
The Zangezur corridor is a proposal primarily championed by Azerbaijan and supported by Turkey to create a land link running through the southernmost part of Armenia, connecting Azerbaijan's main territory to its Nakhchivan exclave. While it sounds like just another route, it is highly politically charged because its construction would compromise Armenian sovereignty and severely disrupt the historical connectivity lines Iran uses to access Armenia and beyond. Since Iran is a critical INSTC partner and Armenia is a growing strategic partner for India, the Zangezur corridor directly represents competing interests among INSTC members, hindering the necessary cooperation needed for the INSTC to fully mature.
It shows that building the physical links is only half the battle. The other half is ensuring the internal state machinery can execute those plans at speed and overcome the political complexities. That brings us to Section 4, the governance challenge. Vitocracy versus velocity. The pivot to Eurasia is impressive on paper, but can the domestic execution keep up with the global velocity demanded by rival corridors?
This is the critical domestic constraint. As we saw in Section 1, the physical metabolic rate is low. Now, we examine why. You can draft the most brilliant strategic maps, but if you cannot pour concrete and lay steel quickly, the strategy remains entirely aspirational, and the gap between $4.18 trillion in physical power only widens.
Let's look at the engineer, Mira, who highlights this internal friction. She is a dedicated civil engineer tasked with supervising a crucial section of a new high-speed rail link. She spends far more time in courtrooms, battling bureaucratic delays, and sitting in endless community halls negotiating than she does on construction sites. She navigates what some political scientists call Western-style vetocracy, a dense thicket of procedural delays, land disputes, and legal injunctions that keep her bulldozers silent for years. She watches time-lapse videos of East Asian velocity, where industrial parks rise in months. She feels the heavy cost of every procedural delay, knowing that while the lawyers argue, the country's industrial skeleton remains dangerously unfinished. This highlights the agonizing friction between procedural democracy and developmental agency.
The term vitocracy, coined by political scientist Francis Fukuyama, precisely defines this dysfunctional system. It is a form of governance where no single entity, not the executive, not the legislature, can acquire enough power to make effective decisions and take effective charge because of an excessive ability or willingness across the system to use veto power. In systems with too many veto points, multiplied by complex legal processes, it becomes incredibly difficult to pass or execute legislation, especially long-term physical infrastructure projects that require decades of sustained commitment.
This sounds remarkably similar to the governance issues seen in the contemporary U.S., which Fukuyama originally analyzed.
The U.S. political system is a classic example cited as being impeded by excessive vetoes, from partisan gridlock in Congress to the power of various committees in the Supreme Court, and, critically, by intense lobbying efforts. The legislative success rate for major bills in the U.S. has plummeted from about 7% to just 2% in the modern era due to this hyper-partisanship making veto points lethal. The danger is that, in the Indian context, this Western-style vetocracy translates into procedural delays that allow local short-term interests, a single landowner, minor judicial challenge, to continually hijack crucial national long-term development projects, thereby crippling execution speed.
Where is this friction most acutely felt on the ground? Mira's story points directly to the land acquisition barrier. You cannot build a modern industrial base without massive acquisition of land for roads, ports, and power plants, and this is where the velocity of governance hits a wall.
Land acquisition is the historical Achilles heel of India's infrastructure development. The complexity stems from the past. The colonial-era Land Acquisition Act of 1894 was often criticized as arbitrary and unjust. The government attempted to correct this with the current system, the Land Acquisition Act of 2013. This new act was designed to protect citizens, ensuring fair compensation and requiring mandatory resettlement and rehabilitation.
But the mechanisms intended to ensure justice created massive procedural delays.
Absolutely. In attempting to ensure social justice, it introduced extremely lengthy procedural requirements, specifically mandatory social impact assessments for every project, and, critically, the requirement of an 80% consent clause for private acquisition. While protecting rights is crucial, the real-world impact on execution speed has been catastrophic.
Give us a specific, high-profile example of how this translates to economic drag.
The classic example is the Mumbai-Ahmedabad bullet train project. It was approved back in 2014, but the land acquisition process proceeded at a glacial pace. By 2020, 6 years later, only 63% of the necessary land had been acquired. The discrepancy between states was telling. Gujarat had acquired 82% of its required land, demonstrating state-level efficacy, but Maharashtra had acquired only 23%. This vast difference in execution speed, stemming from local bureaucratic and political hurdles, effectively stalls a multi-billion-dollar national infrastructure project.
And these localized delays feed into a larger national crisis of execution, the sheer quantity of stalled projects.
Yes. The number of stalled projects, encompassing both private manufacturing facilities and government infrastructure projects, has risen phenomenally. Analysts estimate the total value of these stalled projects amounts to 8 to 9% of India's entire GDP. This inertia severely constrains future private investment, particularly in heavy industry, because the private sector sees the inherent risk in initiating large physical undertakings when procedural delays are endemic and can tie up capital for a decade. The sectors hardest hit are capital-intensive ones like power generation, steel, highways, and mining.
This paralysis connects back directly to our first section. If you can't build the physical foundation, you can't realize the industrial dream, regardless of the nominal $4 trillion valuation. This directly touches on the industrial policy dilemma and jobless growth. The feasibility of the Make in India dream hinges entirely on overcoming these physical and procedural challenges.
The stagnant manufacturing value-added contribution to GDP, holding firm between 14 and 17% for decades, is the structural result of these failures to execute and reform. Recall the figure. In 2013, the services sector contributed a huge 83% to overall economic growth, while manufacturing contributed a paltry 3.3%. This is not the engine that lifts hundreds of millions of people into the middle class. Rapid economic development for a large, poor population requires mass absorption into high-productivity, scalable manufacturing jobs.
And this structural weakness leads to the widely discussed phenomenon of jobless growth. The economy is expanding, but the workforce isn't being absorbed into the productive sectors.
Exactly. The manufacturing sector's share of employment was only 13% in 2011, and the overall number of jobs grew at a meager 1.8% per year over 2 decades, compared to 6.5% growth in the services sector. Furthermore, the employment elasticity in manufacturing, which is how responsive employment numbers are to increases in economic output, dropped into the deeply concerning negative 0.11 range between 2004 and 2010.
That negative elasticity is a chilling indicator. What does negative elasticity specifically tell us about the industrial base?
It implies that even when the manufacturing sector does grow, that growth is not generating jobs. It's actively reducing the need for labor. This is because industries are moving rapidly toward capital-intensive modes of production automation, sophisticated machinery shifting away from labor-intensive methods, which is typically the strength of a country with an abundant workforce. This shift is often driven by intense global competition, but also by domestic factors, such as rigid labor laws.
How do labor laws incentivize capital over labor?
When labor laws make it exceptionally difficult or expensive to lay off workers or manage large employee bases, particularly the smaller, often politically negotiated labor laws at the state level, firms become hesitant to hire large numbers of people. They choose instead to invest heavily in automation and capital, making the workforce smaller, more skilled, and less flexible. This fundamentally undermines the core advantage of India's massive demographic dividend, its sheer quantity of labor.
And speaking of that demographic dividend, the biggest asset the country possesses, it runs into the final internal constraint, the skill deficit. We have the people, but not the trained capacity to run a modern industrial complex.
This is the ultimate synthesis of the domestic challenge. The demographic dividend risks becoming an economic burden, a massive population bulge leading to social instability. If employment opportunities and, crucially, the necessary skills do not materialize quickly enough and at scale. Currently, only about 2% of India's workforce is formally skilled.
That 2% figure is incredibly stark when compared to the developmental states we discussed earlier.
It creates a massive structural mismatch. Contrast that 2% with South Korea, where the rate of formally skilled workers is reported to be over 96%, and Japan at 80%.
Yeah.
Without bridging this immense skill gap, the massive workforce cannot be absorbed into the complex, high-output manufacturing sectors that are desperately needed.
Why is formal vocational training lagging so severely? Is it a capacity issue or a cultural preference issue?
It's a combination of both, but culture plays a huge role. There's a deep cultural preference, particularly among the middle and aspiring middle classes, for university degrees, the paperwork economy, over vocational training. Vocational and technical training often carries a social stigma and is viewed as the default option for those who couldn't achieve higher education. This lack of prestige means that the institutions designed to provide these skills, the Industrial Training Institutes, or ITIs, are often underfunded, poorly linked to industry demand, and produce graduates who lack the modern skills a high-precision welding shop would actually need. This actively harms the manufacturing sector's ability to hire the right personnel, forcing them further toward capital-intensive solutions, which exacerbates the jobless growth problem.
So the $4 trillion economy is facing a moment of truth. The question isn't whether the country can generate wealth in the service sector, but whether it can generate the physical capacity, the steel, the energy, the trained hands, and the state velocity to sustain that wealth and project real power over the long term.
When we synthesize this entire deep dive, the $4.18 trillion figure places India at a critical evolutionary juncture. It is a moment of immense potential. But the ultimate quality inspection of this success will not be judged by the financial headlines or short-term stock market gains. It will be judged by the civil engineers, the steelworkers, and the energy grid operators of the future, the people responsible for the physical reality of the nation.
The strategic shift toward Eurasian physical connectivity, exemplified by projects like the INSTC and the Chennai-Vladivostok corridor, is a highly pragmatic and necessary response to a world where the old maritime-centric order is clearly experiencing entropy and strategic contraction. It is a clear-eyed acknowledgement that physical links are the new currency of strategic autonomy and that the country is prioritizing hard continental power.
However, the central domestic challenge remains unchanged. Forging a national will and an execution system that can bypass the inertia of procedural delays, the vetocracy, and the complexity of its political mechanisms to realize large-scale physical expansion. The future belongs not to the civilization with the best accountants or the highest nominal growth rate, but to the one that can master its physical metabolism, the capacity to pour concrete, reliably power its factories and move goods with speed and precision, and train the workforce to do so.
History is a forensic scientist that only believes in physical evidence. It does not look at the tally of votes or the nominal GDP graph. It examines the tonnage through the ports, the curve of the power grid's load, and the yield rates on the assembly line. The enduring power of a nation is always a function of its physical creation and organizational capability.